Greeting and salutations. I am Lloyd, a producer at LCD Productions, and I have come to share this new series of visual audiobooks with you, the listener, the supporter, the viewer. Together we will go on a journey like never before, fly to new heights with Project Aerospace, explore new land and cityscapes with photations, even change the dimension of time through the power of time-lapse photography from live to tape. We'll even travel beyond the mind's eye into worlds captured and generated through animation from Thumbs United daily animation series. As we together go on these journeys filled with photography and theater of the mind, I hope you remember the core belief that we hold, that anyone can become the master of art, meaning that it is not some born skill what makes someone good at being creative. It is the desire to practice and spend time being creative that creates the master. I hope that these films, photography, and stories inspire you to set some time aside and practice some creativity. I believe if we all spend more time creating and being constructive, the world would be a better place, a more friendlier and fulfilling place. Thank you for coming. Let's begin this journey.
Hello, this is Live to Tape. We're doing the visual audiobook of the Airship, the Golden Hind. This is we're getting close to the end. This is chapter 24, Within Sight of Success. Count Karl von Zinsing had not started upon his long solo flight in the Albatross without studiously calculating his chances. He knew the machine and its capabilities, and given ordinary luck, he saw no reason why he should not make a landing on Spanish soil, replenish fuel, and carry on to his hangar in Estremadura before his hated arrival arrived at Gibraltar. Even if there were delays in obtaining petrol, he still had a useful lead thanks to his 12 hours start in advance of the Golden Hind. The 200 extra miles he had to cover beyond Gibraltar was a mere bagatelle, a question of an hour and 20 minutes flight. He rather regretted that accident to Z-64 had not occurred near the African coast, but realizing that he was lucky to be able to carry on, he ran the risk of a prolonged flight over the sea with comparative equanimity. Within an hour of leaving the wrecked Zeppelin, he sighted two vessels, but with callous indifference to his promise to his crew, he made not the slightest attempt to communicate with either of them. He was all out to win the much-needed Chavez Prize. Even his indictment by the various Allied governments hardly worried him. Time to consider what he would do in the matter when he was safe on Spanish soil, he decided. The Albatross, one of the best types of German machines, was practically an automatic flyer. Von Zinsing could keep her on her course by an occasional pressure with his feet upon the rudder bar, thus leaving both hands free. He was able to eat and drink, to study maps, and to make observations without the risk of the monoplane getting out of control, while, if needs be, he could leave the pilot seat, knowing that the Albatross would hold on automatically for several minutes with only a slight deviation in direction and hardly any difference in altitude. Although only 10 degrees north of the tropics, it was bitterly cold at 10,000 feet, but the Count had taken due precautions to combat the low temperature. He was warmly clad in orthodox flying kit, including sheepskin boots, fleece-lined leather jacket, and trousers, all electrically heated. He had 4 thermal flasks filled with hot coffee and a pocket flask of brandy. For provisions, he carried concentrated food, beef lozenges, and Strasbourg sausages. Hour after hour passed. The Albatross was flying magnificently, her pilot holding on to a compass course. After taking due allowance for the drift of the air current, he based this allowance upon the direction of the wind when he left Z-64, but unknown to him, the light breeze had shifted 8 points and was now blowing slightly ahead of his port beam. Then, having backed it presently veered 6 points and blew with increasingly force right against the Albatross, but von Zinsing was for the present in ignorance of the fact. Had he known that instead of following breeze about 20 miles an hour there was ahead wind approaching the neighborhood of 35 miles, he would not have been so choke and block with confidence. When at the end of the time limit he had set he was not in sight of land, he began to feel anxious. Half an hour later, as he was still without a glimpse of the coast, his misgivings increased, but 10 minutes later he picked up land on his right. This was a puzzle. He had expected to make landfall right ahead, and its appearance in an unexpected quarter mystified him. In point of fact, he was in the neighborhood of Cape Blanco, or nearly 250 miles south of Cape St. Vincent, where he hoped to pass over on his way to Estremadura. And knowledge of the Moroccan coast obtained during his cruise in a German gunboat at the time of Agadir crisis stood von Zinsing in good stead. He was able to recognize certain landmarks in spite of viewing them from a different aspect, and accordingly he turned the monoplane in a northeasterly direction, keeping parallel to the African coast. The new direction would take him a little to the eastward of Cadiz, rather nearer the point than Gibraltar. He had not the slightest inclination to fly over the latter fortress. Rather vaguely he wondered whether he would sight the Golden Hind making hither, since sooner or later, unless a mishap occurred, the rival aviator must cut each other's route. He was painfully aware of the change of wind, the direction of the smoke from several steamers, and the sight of a full-rigged ship running in a southwesterly direction told him that additionally, as he saw by the aid of his binoculars, that the sailing ship was running under topsail only. That meant something more than a stiff breeze. Against this had to contend. Suddenly he detected an ominous cough of the motor. He knew that the petrol supply was running low, but he had no idea that the gauge registered so little. The tank was practically empty. Himmel, gasped the dumbfounded Hun. Will she last out? He mentally measured the distance between him and the Spanish coast, a good 10 miles. With a following wind, he could glide that distance from an altitude, but not with this infernal headwind. The engine was running jerkily. Clearly, its spasmodic coughing beckoned to the fact that it would soon cease duty from sheer annihilation, its lifeblood being cut off at the heart of the machine, its petrol tanks. That headwind, how von Zinsing cursed it. Had it been in his favor, even if he failed to volleyplane as far as the shore, the Albatross, being provided with floats, would have drifted on the surface. In the midst of his incoherent utterances, von Zinsing realized that the motor had at last given out. He trimmed the ailerons and prepared for a long glide, but as he feared, the headwind made it a matter impossible for the Albatross to cover more than 2 miles before she aligned. It did not take long to complete the volplane, although the pilot nursed his machine to the best of his ability in the hope of prolonging the oblique descent. The Albatross landed badly, her float striking the water with a resounding smack. The Count, having done his best, could do no more. He sat smoking his cigarette and keeping a lookout for a vessel that would come to his assistance. There were several away to the southward, for he had aligned well to the northward and the regular steamer track between Gibraltar and Cape St. Vincent. There were too far off to notice the little Albatross. Then von Zinsing made the disconcerting discovery that the starboard float was leaking. Already, owing to this cause, the monoplane was listing so that her starboard wing tip was touching the water. This fact, combined with the knowledge that he was momentarily drifting farther and farther away from land did not tend to improve the Hun's peace of mind. Half an hour later, during which time the monoplane had drifted at least 3 miles and was being considerably buffeted by the rising sea, von Siensing noticed that a vessel was bearing down upon the crippled albatross. As she approached, the Count saw that she was a small motor yacht of about 40 or 50 tons, and that she was flying the barge of the Real Club Mediterraneo and the Spanish insignia. The sight of the Spanish colors gave von Siensing renewed hope. The yacht slowed down and lost way a few yards to the northward of the monoplane. For a small vessel, she carried a large crew. There were half a dozen men forward, clad in white canvas jumpers and trousers, and wearing red woolen caps. Aft there were 2 gorgeous attired individuals in gold-laced yachting uniforms. Von Siensing, who was a fair Spanish linguist, hailed them. A rope thrown from the bow of the yacht fell across the nose of the albatross. This the Count caught and secured. "Can you supply me with petrol, senor?" asked von Siensing. "My tank is empty. 100 liters will be enough." One of the gold-laced men shook his head and extended his hand, palms upmost. "I am desolate at being compelled to refuse your excellency modest request," he replied, "but we have paraffin engines and carry only a small quantity of petrol for starting purposes. How far have you come?" "Nearly round the world," replied the Hun graciously. He could not resist the typical Teutonic trait of the self-advertisement. "Dios!" exclaimed the Spaniard, twirling his long mustache. "Then you are Count Karl von Siensing, who left Quintor in the province of Estremadura 16 or 17 days ago?" "I am," admitted von Siensing proudly. The Spaniard said a few words in an undertone to his companion. The other's eyes gleamed, and he nodded his head vigorously. "We will take you on board and tow your machine," announced the owner of the yacht. "To Cazid or Huevas?" asked the Count. "Accept 10,000 regrets, Count," replied the Spaniard. "We must take you to Gibraltar." But I have no wish to be taken to Gibraltar," declared von Siensing. "I will give 1,000 pesetas to land at Cadiz." The Don again shrugged his shoulders. "No doubt my crew would be glad of your offer of 1,000 pesetas, Count," he replied. "But since they know that the English have offered a reward equal to 5,000 pesetas, you would sell me?" demanded von Siensing furiously. "I sell you, senor? No, I, Caballero of Spain. You insult me by the suggestion. I recollect, however, that I once had a brother. He was lost at sea while traveling on an English vessel from New York to Cadiz. Like you, he wanted to land at Cadiz, but he had not able to do so. For why? Because the ship was torpedoed by one of your ever accursed U-boats. Therefore I have a small measure of revenge when I hand you over to the English authorities at Gibraltar. Be pleased, senor, to step on board." Covered by an automatic pistol, Count Karl von Siensing had no option but to obey. In the race around the world, he was down and out. Chapter 25. Fire. Sir Reginald Forsyth laid down his pencil and uttered an exclamation of intense satisfaction. He had just shot the sun and had finished working out his position. Another hour will see Gibraltar, lads," he announced joyously. "Then there'll be some malflacking. What's your program? Going to pack your suitcase and back by the Madrid-Paris express?" "You are not leaving the Golden Hind at Gibraltar?" asked Kenneth. "No," replied the baronet, "but I must certainly get some repairs executed before I resume my flight to England. I thought perhaps you were in a hurry to get home." "There's no immediate hurry, sir," declared the chums simultaneously. "A few more days won't matter," began Kenyon, but before he could proceed with his explanation, the alarm bell rang violently and continuously. "What's wrong now?" exclaimed Forsyth, snatching up the voice tube. Peter glanced aft through the window of the navigation room, which, being raised, gave a clear view over the roof of the rest of the nacelle, and saw at once what was amiss. Dense volumes of smoke, tinged with dull red flames, were pouring from the aft end of the fuselage, fanning by the rush of the airship. The black vapor was streaming in, was awake like a fox's tail. Leaving Kenyon to take charge of the navigation room, and cautioning him to keep the Golden Hind dead in the eye of the wind, and as fast as she could possibly go, Fordyke and Peter hastened aft. They found the alleyway thick with smoke, for on the well-known principle that the wind follows the ship, the draught had carried the fumes within the nacelle in the forward direction. A man wearing a smoke helmet brushed past them. It was Hayward, going to find some fire extinguishers. Others of the crew, who had hastily donned masks to protect themselves from choking vapor, were busily engaged in hurling pyrene into the seat of the conflagration. Although the speed of the Golden Hind through the air fanned the flames, Fordyke had done well to order speed to be maintained. The velocity had the effect of compelling the fire trail astern instead of spreading upward, and thus destroying the envelope. Even as it was, the heat had caused the non-inflammable baridium to expand, giving the envelope a tendency to trim down by the head. "Petrol tank number 5 motor, sir," reported a grimly and perspiring mechanic, who, through sheer exhaustion and being partly gassed by the noxious fumes, had to withdraw from the fray, "went up all of a sudden, like never saw such a fire flare up in all my life, sir, but we're getting it under." It was indeed a stiff fight. In a few seconds the area of the fire had attained such large dimensions that it was impossible to reach the actual source. The firefighters had first to subdue the fringe of the conflagration, and by the time they had done this several of them were hors de combat by reasons of suffocating, gases thrown off by the oxygen exterminated pyrene. Above the crackling of the flames came the sharp tang of suspension wires holding the nacelle to the aluminum envelope as they parted under the terrific heat. Not only were the crew faced with the danger of the fire getting the upper hand, the while there was a chance of portion of the fuselage coming detached from the gas bag, and the prospect of being hurled through space from the height of 8,000 or 9,000 feet above the sea was one that might well end in cold blood, put fear into the heart of the bravest of brave. But in the heat of action, the crew, knowing the danger, faced the risk manfully. Working in relays, they piled the flames with fire-extinguishing chemicals. As fast as one man fell out, temporarily overcome by the fumes, the terrific heat, another took his place until the fire was overcome. Even then the danger was not over. There was still a possibility of the smoldering fuselage being fanned into a blaze. Parts of the aluminum framework and paneling were warped and twisted into frantic shapes. Snake-like coils and wires indicated the fact that several of the highly important connections between the fuselage and the envelope had been burnt through. Whether the sufficient number of tension wires remained to adequately support the aftermath of the nacelle remained a matter of doubt. Unaccountably, the petrol tank feeding number 5 motor had taken fire. The pipes and unions had been frequently examined and found to be in good order. In fact, Hayward had personally inspected the fitting on that particular tank less than a quarter of an hour before the outbreak. The damage was serious. Both nose 5 and 6 motors were out of action, the former showing signs of cracking through the charred framework of the fuselage. The flames had spread to Fordyke's cabin, completely gutting it. Only a few aluminum frames were left, and these, blackened and bent, trailed forlornly astern like gaunt skeletons. With the contraction of the baridium after the fire had been quelled, the envelope, instead of tending to tilt aft, now showed a tendency to droop. The heat had melted the solder of the union pipes through which the gas had passed either to or from the pressure flasks, and several thousand feet of baridium had escaped. Driving only by 4 propellers, her precious scanty supply of baridium sadly depleted, and with the control of the 2 afterplane damaged by the flames, the Golden Hind was in serious was in perilous state. She was just able and no more to overcome the attention of gravity. How long she would be able to maintain herself in the air was a problem of supposition. Had the Golden Hind been supported by hydrogen gas, nothing could have saved her. The overcoming of the flames was a triumph for the fire-resisting propeller properties of barium. The patient gas had been put to one of the severest tests, an actual fire in mid-air, and had emerged with flying colors. From the time of the alarm bell being raised until the fire was subdued, only half an hour had elapsed. The smoke-crimmed and fatigued crew were glad to rest, while Forsyth and Peter returned to the navigation room. They were to wash and replace their singed and reeking clothes with other from Kenyon's and Berndine's kit bags. The baronet had to borrow a suit. The one he was wearing was in holes, while all his others on board were destroyed when his cabin was burnt out. Forsyth was cheerful. In fact, he was jocular. He realized that things might have been far worse had he was glad to find that the Golden Hind was still navigable and that none of his crew had sustained injury. "This comes as boasting, Kenyon," he remarked. "I said we being Gibraltar in an hour, we stood a chance of being the kingdom come. What's she doing now?" "Nothing more than 80, sir," replied Kenyon, "and we're stiffish wind to contend with." "80, eh? Not so dusty, considering we're trailing the wreckage of my cabin astern, and there's only 4 props to shove us along. She's dipping, though." "She is, sir," agreed Kenyon gravely. "I've trimmed the plane to their maximum. That tends to shove her nose up, but if I didn't, she'd sit on her tail." "We'll finish at the tape like an aerial Cleopatra needle," declared Forsyth. "Hello there, Tangier. That strip of blue you can just see beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. We're a bit to the eastward of our course." Another half an hour of strenuous battling against the heavy odds brought by the Golden Hind immediately to the west of Ceuta. Ahead could be discerned the famous rock, although viewed from an altitude and on its well-known appearance as a lion crouching was absent. But the Golden Hind had shot her bolt. "We're balked at the tape," declared Forsyth. "The headwind's doing us hard line, but we must take things as we find them." Like von Senzing, he had been beaten by the head wind, but Forsyth, instead of raving and cursing like a German rival, accepted the situation philosophically. It was hard lines flailing within sight of the goal, but the baronet kept a stiff upper lip. He had done everything humanly possible to achieve his aim. He could do no more. The Golden Hind's incline at the angle of 60 degrees was dropping slowly but surely. With her remaining motors running all out, she was able to overcome the pull of gravity. Even as she dropped, her progress toward her goal was maintained at a rate of a bare 5 miles an hour above and against that of the wind. Every man on board was holding on like a grim death. With the floor as steep as the roof of a house, there was nothing to be done but to hold on. The bayonets were practically empty, save for 4 or 5 forward ones. The propellers were now virtually hellies, whirling screws that strove valiantly but unavailingly to lift the huge bulk of the airship in an almost vertical direction. Should the motors fail to function, then the Golden Hind would drop like a stone. It was as it was. She was failing surely and slowly. Already officers and men had donned their inflatable life belts. There was not one of the slight sign of panic. The men, although keenly disappointed at their failure within sight of success, were joking with each other. "Stand by to jump, all hands," shouted Forsyth. "Keep clear of the raffle, and you'll be as right as rain. There's a dozen vessels within a couple miles of us." Some of the men slid along the sloping alleyway to the side doors. Others tore away the large celluloid windows in the cabin and motor rooms, so as to be able to jump clear of the direction the fuselage touched the water. The two chums had drawn themselves through the window of the navigation room and were standing on the blunt bow and steadying themselves by the tension wires running from the normal top of the nacelle to the underside of the envelope. With the four motors running to the last, the Golden Hind dropped into the sea. Her projecting envelope was the first to come into contact with the water. The ballonet's practically airtight compartments checked the downward movement, while the hitherto inclined bulk, pivoted as it were by the seaborne stern, dropped until it resumed its normal horizontal position. Fordyke alone had remained in the navigation room. Directly he saw that the airship was resting temporarily on the surface and was beginning to gather way like a gigantic hydroplane. He switched off the remaining motors. "Every man for himself," he shouted. Chapter 26. Well played, sir. Water poured into the open doors and windows and through the charmed and torn stern of the nacelle. The aluminum envelope, not built to withstand a normal stress, began buckling midship. Tension wires, no longer in tension but in compression, were spreading in all directions as the huge gas bag settled down upon the already foundering nacelle. Every one of the crew realized the danger of being entangled in the wreckage. In a trice, the water was dotted with heads and shoulders of life-belted swimmers as the crew struck out to get clear of the sinking airship. And presently Fordyke was surrounded by a little mob of undaunted men. "Thanks heavens," ejaculated the baronet, after a hasty count. "None missing. Keep together, lads. There's a vessel bearing down on us." Not one but four crafts were hastening to the rescue. Among these was TBD Zenberg, which 18 days previously had gone to search for the derelict Golden Hind and had placed Sir Reginald Fordyke on board. Fortunately, the water was warm, and in spite of a fairly high sea running, the late crew of the Golden Hind were taken aboard the destroyer. Fordyke and the others, declining to go below, stood on deck and watched the end of the airship that had taken them safely for nearly 28,000 miles to perish within 5 miles of the Rock of Gibraltar, her official starting point. The end was not long delayed. The buckling of aluminum envelope resulted in the bayonets after ballets collapsing under the pressure of water. The fuselage had already disappeared. Bow and stern, nearly 400 feet apart, reared themselves high in the air. Then, with a terrific rush of mingled barium and the air that caused the seething cauldron around each of the extremities of the envelope, the last of the Golden Hind sank beneath the waves. "Rough luck losing such a fine airship," commiserated Lieutenant Commander of the destroyer. "It is," agreed Fordyke, feeling especially as she was my own design, and I superintended every bit of her construction. It was a pity, too, we didn't hang on for another half hour. I'd have jockeyed her over the rocks somehow." "It was a brilliant achievement, Sir Reginald," said the naval officer. "Every sportsman will sympathize with you, but I'm sure they'll shout, 'Well played, sir.'" "Any news of the other competitors?" asked Peter. "Yes, Commodore Nye. The Yankee is still stranded in Australia, but I suppose you know that. Count Hayashi crashed somewhere near Saigon. He, too, was almost home." "Jolly hard lines," murmured Kenyon sympathetically. "Was he hurt?" "No, hardly bruised, but a bit shaken. Engine failure, they say," continued the lieutenant commander. "That leaves only the Hind to be counted for." "And I suppose he's completed the circuit," remarked Fordyke questionably. The naval officer laughed. "Completed the circuit of a prison yard," he exclaimed. "That's about his mark. A Spanish yacht brought Count von Sinzing in this morning and handed him over to the port admiral. He'll be a 3-year job, I fancy. Hind must learn what they can't bomb British air stations in peacetime with impunity." The destroyer ran alongside the dockyard. Fordyke and the rest of his crew disembarked on the jetty. They were met by several of the chief naval, military, and air force officials, and 2 representatives of the International Air Board. Fordyke looked puzzled. He didn't want commiseration. but congratulations seemed a bit out of place. On what grounds, Admiral asked. On winning the Chavez Prize for completing the circumnavigation of the globe, replied the senior International Air Board representative, speaking instead of the Point Admiral. Fact, you've won it fair and squarely. But, began the astonished baronet. You have, persisted the official. Do you recollect the airship broke adrift? The destroyer went in pursuit and put you on board. That was within 3 miles or so of Ceuta. The same destroyer picked you up out of the water 5 miles from Gibraltar. Consequently, you've more than completed the circuit, and although the official start was from Gibraltar, I don't think there will be any difficulty in obtaining the International Air Board's decision to the effect that you've won. And that was exactly what happened. Had it not been for Count von Zinsing's underhand work in employing Enrico Gervais to cast adrift the Golden Hind, Fordyce would not have completed his aerial voyage around the world. By the irony of fate, the Hind had enabled his rival to score. Fordyce won the Chavez Prize and the honor of being the first man to fly around the world. Needless to say, Kenyon and Branston and the rest of their crew were not forgotten. Honors were heaped upon the intrepid airmen. They were lionized, feted, and praised to such an extent that they were in danger of developing swelled heads. But Kenyon and Branston knew that the achievement would be but a 9-day wonder. Having attempted it one, they were content to return to their professions. Their financial standings much increased by their shares in the big prize. They had enough honor and diplomas to satisfy them, but what they prized most was a certificate from the Royal Humane Society for saving the crew of Hilda P. Merchant. So after all, declared Kenyon, we did do something useful, old son. And that was the end of the Golden Airship. I want to thank everyone for coming out. We did this visual audiobook in 9 parts. It is being released on YouTube, but I'm going to re-edit it a little bit, and then it will be coming to live to tape, a 4K UHD version without all the title sequences and everything. So that will be removed and slightly re-edited, but it will still very much be live to tape. There just might be 1 or 2 cuts through the 9-part series. So I want to thank everyone for coming out. This is the last stream of the night. I hope to see everyone tomorrow. I will find a new book to read. And it will be a little bit different. We won't be doing a partnership with Project Aerospace. I believe we'll either do a flow series, which is Steadicam work through forests and architecture, or we will do time-lapse photography, what I call drive-lapse photography. So I want to thank everyone for coming out, and I'm excited to see everyone tomorrow. And I'm going to start a rerun. I uploaded the entire Pam the Pioneer visual audiobook, so I will be rerunning that, and then the second part of the rerun will be the complete series of the Airship the Golden Hind. So I want to thank everyone for coming out. I'll see everyone tomorrow. Bye bye.